What was it like being drafted as an 18-year-old to fight? To start off, the men were picked at random, and they were between the age of 18 to 25. They would be called out through birthday in order from class 001 being 18-year-olds, born on September 14th. That meant that anyone who had that birthday would automatically be drafted with no decision to say no. Before the drafting began, there was a major speculation that was proven that the overwhelming majority of soldiers before 1969 were actually more minorities being drafted and coming back missing body parts, and a lot were dying. This is what led to the starting of the drafts in 1969. Leading 18-year-old men into battle caused a lot of backlash from not the men who came back, but also the people who stayed in the U.S. The men went through a lot of mental abuse during training and during the war. They came back with a lot of PTSD, and a lot of them had problems.
During Vietnam, boot camp was shortened down from 13 weeks to about 6 to 8 weeks to get more soldiers out to Vietnam. Boot camp during the Vietnam War involved a lot of intense physical training, mental conditioning, and preparation for war. Recruits underwent rigorous drills, weapons training, first aid, and learned military tactics. The environment was demanding and stressful and aimed to instill discipline and camaraderie among soldiers to prepare them for the challenges of war in Vietnam. It also trained them for the jungle conditions of Vietnam. Boot camp was so overwhelming for some people that it gave them trauma and mental distress, some even killing themselves because they couldn't handle it anymore.
For the African American soldiers in Vietnam, the experience was often complex. On one hand, they faced racial discrimination within the military, similar to the experiences they had faced back home. However, the shared experience of combat sometimes fostered bonds that transcended into the racial differences. To add on, the civil rights movements back in the United States influenced discussions about equality within the military in Vietnam, leading to some changes and improvements in the treatment and the opportunities for African American soldiers. Overall, the Vietnam War was an era of time of both challenges and progress for civil rights for many Americans that were serving at the time. Many people that pursued higher education in the United States were granted deferments from the draft as long as they remained enrolled in a college or universities. Also, wealthy families often had political connections that could be used to influence people from being drafted, and they could skip these through various channels. They could also afford medical exceptions through private doctors that would forge medical conditions that would disqualify them from military service.
The war disrupted traditional ways of living. In the U.S., the war also caused significant damage on the economy, shifting resources from domestic programs to foreign aid, causing inflation and exacerbating the nation's already increasing public debt. In addition, the war's effects on the poor and minority communities were worsened by the disproportionate impact of the draft on the lives of low-income and marginalized communities, resulting in social unrest against the war. One big problem with low-income and marginalized communities was that most of the selected drafts were selected to young people, which were mostly right out of high school and had little education. Also, the fact that President Johnson was unwilling to raise taxes, the U.S. went into a state of constant inflation.
How did racism play an effect in the American soldiers in the Vietnam War? African American soldiers and other minority races faced many different challenges throughout the Vietnam War. They faced racial discrimination even though they were giving up their life to defend their country and the citizens of the United States. Discrimination came in many different ways, like being given the more dangerous tasks that had more death probability, and they were giving unequal treatment in the ranks of the military. In simple terms, they were facing terrible reality of racism at home and at war. They were fighting for the ideas of freedom and a better life when they got back home after the war. Due to racism that minorities had to face, they ended up revolting against the United States and starting protests and fighting for their rights after the war.